Let's see, coming off of last week, I started this whole series describing a mountaintop experience, right? And if you remember the first sermon that I preached, I discussed what it was like for me to go from Lakeview and hike all the way up to the top of the Sierras, and I could see all of Washoe. From the top of the Sierras, you can see the big picture of Washoe Valley. You can see the lake and the shape of the lake. You can see the color of the grasses, depending on what time of the year it is. You can see the road, the highway that just cuts a straight line through Washoe Valley. You can see where it starts in Carson, where it ends in Pleasant Valley. You can see from up on top of that mountain the whole big picture, right? And that was our first sermon, is to look at the Sermon on the Mount as a big picture. And in that sermon, I told you there was a key to understanding the Sermon on the Mount. And I kind of forgot to remind everybody each week about the key to understanding the Sermon on the Mount. It's found in Matthew chapter 6. And so you can open up your Bibles. We're doing a study in the Sermon on the Mount, so we're always going to be right there in Matthew chapter 5 and 6 and 7, because those are the chapters that contain the Sermon on the Mount. But when I first preached this sermon in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, I told you this is the key to understanding the Sermon on the Mount. It says this: "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well." Right there in Matthew chapter 6, it gives us a key to understanding the text. It says we need to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well. And my concern is that as we started looking at the Sermon on the Mount in more detail, we might have lost focus of that original key, that it's his kingdom and his righteousness that we're standing under, right? So I want to get back to the big idea. Jesus is talking about righteousness, and he begins in the character of the kingdom subjects talking about hunger and thirst for righteousness. This idea that we should be like starving for righteousness. This vivid language of wanting righteousness. And whose righteousness is it that we want? We want God's righteousness. We seek his righteousness, right? His kingdom and his righteousness. That promise of that first, that section of the Beatitudes is that when you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, when you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you will be filled. And so we looked at the details of the character of the kingdom subject. And when we live out those characters found in the Beatitudes, we are salt and light to a world. And Jesus says that they'll see your good deeds and they'll glorify your Father in heaven, right? And so we talked in that sermon about what it's like to be a light that shines bright. And we're just a reflection of the sun. We're a reflection of Jesus because we're standing under his righteousness, not our own. And so we're reflecting Jesus' righteousness back on the world. And when we're doing that, we're following Jesus' command to, and this is found in chapter 5, verse 19, "Let your light shine so that people will see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So we are kingdom subjects displaying kingdom characteristics in a world, and when we do that, our nature shines through. Not because we're righteous, but because Christ is righteous, and we stand under his righteousness, our nature shines through. But good deeds would have been understood by everyone in Jesus' audience, because remember, he's standing on the side of the mountain with the disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, who had left everything to go and follow him. And he's standing there on the mountain, and he says that they see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And they begin to wonder, like, what are these good deeds? And so Jesus goes into the law. He talks about the law and how he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. See, that's where we stand today, in the fulfillment of the law. And we remember, as I referenced last week, that Jesus was on the cross and he said, "It is finished." But one text I didn't get to last week is found in Luke. And this is Luke chapter 16. And it's verse 16, so that's appropriate. But here's what it says. "The law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since that time, the good news of the kingdom of God is being preached, and everyone is forcing their way into it." So there's this dividing line that the disciples and that we're standing on. Up to John the Baptist, it was the law and the prophets. After that, or since that time, according to Luke, it's been the kingdom of God. And so the disciples were on the mountain on a divided line between the law and the prophets and the fulfilled kingdom. But where do we stand today? We stand in the fulfilled kingdom. Jesus said it is finished, right? And to bear this out, in Romans chapter 8, it talks about where we are today. And I really want to get this out because here's what it says. Therefore, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit of life has set you free from the law of sin and death. And so if there's anything that we should be taking from this, it's that we're no longer living under an old covenant law and prophets. They haven't been abolished, they've been fulfilled. And we stand in their fulfillment. And then in Romans 13, Paul tells us that when we love others, we ourselves are fulfilling the law. So we understand that we have this relationship with that law and prophet, that we're supposed to love. Jesus says that's what fulfills the law. Paul says that's what fulfills the law. And when we love others, we're also fulfilling the law. Jesus satisfied the law. And as Christians, we go out and we live that example that Jesus gave us of loving others. And so that's where we stand today. But on the end of last week, the end of the sermon in Matthew chapter 5, and this is in verse 20. And if you're looking at your Bible, you can see it. I didn't put it on the screen. It says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And I've had a lot of discussion this week with people who question, what does it mean for our righteousness to surpass that of the Pharisees? And I want to remind you again of the key, that we seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, not our own, right? I want to remind you again that we hunger and thirst for righteousness, and the promise is that we will be fulfilled. Righteousness has a meaning of to be in right standing or to be in good standing with. And we can stand in front of God even though we're poor in spirit because He paid the way. But still we have to try to live a life that is in good standing with God. Isn't that what we should be trying to do every day as we go about our life, is to live a life that is in good standing? We should be going about our life to live righteously in front of God, right? Not in front of man, because we are not in the kingdom of the world. We're in the kingdom of heaven. We are the salt of the world, the light of the world. We try to live a righteous life before God, to be in good standing. And it needs to be genuine, because Jesus says about the Pharisees that they're whitewashed tombs. They're beautiful on the outside, but inside they're full of dead man's bones. And that shouldn't be you as a Christian. You should be genuine, beautiful on the outside, which all of you are. I can see all your smiling faces. You're beautiful on the outside, but you're beautiful on the inside too. You're a genuine person. That's what it means to be somebody who is righteous. We're genuine. As we go forward, and I don't know how far we're going to get in this study tonight, it may carry over to next week. Jesus gives us 6 different sections on what it means to be righteous, to be more righteous than the Pharisees in the way that we live our life with others. And so I titled this sermon, the righteousness, our righteousness with our neighbors, right? Our righteousness with our neighbors. Because the next 6 sections, all of chapter 5, is going to be how we're supposed to live our lives around people in a way that displays kingdom righteousness so that people can see our good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven. And so we're going to be covering Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, and we're going to hope to get to verse 48, right? 6 different sections where Jesus talks about our righteousness and how it interacts with others. In each of these sections, Jesus is going to quote a law or a common understanding of a law, and then He's going to lift it up so that it can be seen through God's eyes. So we can see God's intent behind it. So we can see God's heart in the law. 6 different laws that we view, and I want you to know that we don't view these in a lens of legalism. We view these understanding that the best of our righteousness can be like filthy rags. These 6 statements should make you feel as if you're a sinner who's fallen short to the glory of God. See, because we're going to read these and we're going to see, oops, I messed up there. Right? We're going to see that because we all kind of mess up. But this is our goal. This is the standard of righteousness that we are hungering and thirsty for. This is the standard of righteousness that we are seeking. And so let's look at the first one. The first one is that kingdom righteousness extends to our thoughts and our actions. That's my first point. Kingdom righteousness extends to our thoughts and our actions. And this is going to be in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. And look at what Jesus says. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone says, you fool, is in danger of hell. I want you to know that if you guys get a little bit intimidated by the word hell, you're going to have a hard time with Jesus' words because he uses it a lot, right? He uses the word hell a lot, so let's get comfortable with it. Jesus is lifting our standard of righteousness past the action of murder to the intent behind it. See, murder is just the last stop on a train that's gone out of control way, way back. And so Jesus says that our righteousness, all right, but I tell you that anybody who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Now we have to deal with this a little bit because Jesus gets angry and his anger was a righteous anger. Do you guys agree with that? Jesus got angry. He went into the temple courts and he drove the people out and he said, my Father's house should be a house of prayer, but you have called it a den of thieves. And so we know as people, as kingdom people, that we can have righteous anger, right? I've had righteous anger even this week. We can have righteous anger, but we're not very good at it. Right? Think of Moses who comes down from Mount Sinai with the 10 commandments, the ones that we talked about today, written on stones. And when he sees the people engaging in idolatry, he smashes the commandments. Do you think that made God happy? No. When the people were complaining that there was no water and no food, Moses struck the rock twice. And God got angry at Moses and said he couldn't go into the land. Moses had a reason to be a little bit frustrated, a little bit angry, but how he dealt with his anger was a problem. And so we have to understand the intent behind the anger. When Jesus says, I tell you, anybody who's angry with his brother or sister is guilty, he's saying, like, we have to make sure that the way we deal with even our righteous anger is in a way that is in keeping with God's law. See, anger is dangerous. Look at Ephesians chapter 4. In verse 26, it says this, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. There's Ephesians chapter 6. When we're angry, right, Paul isn't saying, hey, don't be angry. He's saying, in your anger, don't sin. Because even when we have righteous anger, we can mess it up like Moses. Jesus says, that you've heard it said, you shouldn't murder, but I tell you, anybody who's angry with his brother or sister can stand in front of the court, right? Because that anger will often lead to words that aren't so great, right? And that's what he goes on to say in verse 22. Anyone who's angry will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka. Now, Raka is a Hebrew word. It means empty head or like foolish person, right? It would have been a big dig for those people. And he says, so anybody who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone says, you fool, will be in the danger of fires of hell. See, because when we're angry, sometimes that leads to our mouth saying things that it probably shouldn't. See, the reason God cares about murder is because he cares about the sanctity of life. But that sanctity of life extends to how we talk to one another. We just can't go around cursing at each other or saying things that aren't in keeping with kingdom character. We have to make sure that even the words that come out of our mouth represent the king. Right? So when we wonder, what does it mean to be more righteous than the Pharisees? It's taking that action of murder and taking it back to the very, very foundation of it. Your anger, which led to words. See, because kingdom righteousness extends from our thoughts to our mouth to our actions. So look at what Jesus says next. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, this is verse 23. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come off to offer your gift. So I have to wonder, does anybody need to leave at this point? Does anybody have somebody that you know has something against you, right? We're not talking about you being angry with someone else. Jesus is talking about someone who might be angry with you. And what he says is you should leave your gift, go and reconcile things with your brother, and then come back and offer your gift to God. Why? Because God desires mercy, not sacrifice. That's what he cares about, is mercy. And he cares that we make an attempt to fix things with our brothers and sisters. Obviously, worship is important. Obviously, that gift is important. That offering is important. But what is far more important to God is that we treat people like we care. That we have sanctity for life. That extends past just the act of murder and begins with our thoughts, our words, and our actions. So Jesus gives us a way to be proactive about this. He says that we should actually treat people with kindness. We should make sure that we're doing things to bring about reconciliation. And then he goes on to say, settle matters quickly with your adversaries who's taking you to court. That word adversary means opponent. So this isn't just a brother or sister. This is somebody who's actually against you. He's your opponent. And settle matters quickly. Do it while you're still together or on your way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you that you will not get out until you've paid every last penny. This is somebody who has something against you, and what Jesus is saying is take care of it right away. Because if we don't take care of things right away, they begin to fester until we're stuck in a prison of our own making. I was in the youth center just a few years ago, and I was just hanging out with the kids like I typically do, and somebody came into the youth center, this lady that I don't remember, and she begins apologizing to me for the things that she had said, and I couldn't remember who she was. But for years, apparently, this lady had built a prison of anger and unforgiveness, and I had no idea who she was. So I did the kingdom thing. And I told her, it's okay, I forgive you, right? And you could see the relief. See, I didn't put her in the prison, she put herself in the prison, but I was able to help her out of it by just extending forgiveness. Jesus is telling us that when we have somebody that he would call an opponent or an adversary, that we don't let it fester until we're in a prison of our own making. Instead, we deal with that situation right away before it becomes a bigger problem. Because at some point, you may be in prison and there's no way out. And so kingdom righteousness is a righteousness that begins with it begins with our thoughts, goes on to our words, and ends up in our actions, right? So when you're questioning what righteousness should surpass that of the Pharisees, it's a righteousness that begins with our thoughts, moves to our words, and continues in our actions. Here's the next one. This is the next of the 6 statements that Jesus gives us, and I'm hoping we get through all 6. This one has to do with adultery. But maybe it has more to do with lust. Listen to what he says. You have heard that it was said you should not commit adultery. By the way, that was another one of the 10 commandments. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So the bigger issue that Jesus is saying is that you're committing adultery or lust with your heart. And this shows us our second point, that kingdom righteousness begins in our heart. Right? Kingdom righteousness begins in our hearts. It's part of our thoughts, our words, our actions, and it's our heart. Because it's not about the act of adultery. That's just the last stop on a train that began with lust. Now, the word lust means to desire, right? So just like anger, there is a time where you can desire something good. Like Jesus, before the Passover meal, says, I've eagerly desired to have this meal with you. That's the same word is used here, so it can have a positive idea to it. But when it's desiring someone else or sexual things, then it becomes lust. And here's the big problem. There's lots of problems with lust, but here's one that I want to key in on. When you're lusting after another person, you don't care about the person. They become just another object of your fantasy. And so we can care about the sanctity of life, but when you degrade somebody to the point where they're just an object of your fantasy, you're not living kingdom characteristics. Lust begins in the heart, but Jesus is calling us to treat people like they were created in the image of God. Not objects for us to lust over, but created in the image of God. Now, I know when we started this Sermon on the Mount, we were talking about Jesus, and he's on the side of the mountain, and he's with his disciples. They're there with him, and it's all guys. And so Jesus says things like anyone who looks at a woman lustfully, but I have 2 kids, right? Both of them are boys. I've seen their girlfriends. And I know that it's not only the guys that have a problem with lust. In fact, I think it's the girls you have to worry about too, right? I can't be alone. I know that it's the girls that have problem with lust, mostly because I'm a youth pastor and I've dealt with girls that have problem with lust and boys that have problem with lust. And I know that it's not just this one-sided thing, right? And Jesus gives us some radical ideas on how to deal with this. Now let's see if this makes practical sense to you. In verse 29, he says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. You guys think that's a practical way to deal with lust? No? All right, how about this one? It is better for you to lose part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose part of your body than your whole body to go to hell. That doesn't seem very practical, does it? I mean, if this was what we really did to deal with lust, then everybody in this room would have one less hand and one less eye. Right? Jesus is being hyperbolic. He's saying things like something to over-exaggerate to prove a point. Like if I was to say my kids have a mountain of homework to do, they don't actually have a mountain of homework. If I say, you're older than dirt, you're not older than dirt, right? You're not. And so Jesus is over-exaggerating so that you can get a point. The reason I know this is true is because prior to saying this, Jesus tells us where lust comes from. It doesn't come from the eye and it doesn't come from the hand. It comes from the heart, right? Anybody who lusts after someone in their heart has committed adultery. And so I don't see anybody or even Jesus advocating that we rip out our heart. Is he? No, he's not advocating for that. He's saying you should go to the most extreme measures to deal with this sin. As a youth pastor, I've seen kids come in and talk to them about the problem of lust. And I think sometimes they would probably rather chop off their hand than have to tell people what they've been doing. Right? Like it's embarrassing. But hear this in Jesus' words. If you're not willing to shame yourself, to expose yourself to a little bit of shame in order to come to a point of righteousness. See, that's what like cutting off your hand or gouging out your eye is pretty shameful. But you have to go to those shameful extremes to deal with the problem. You might have to go and talk to somebody about it and confess it and help deal with it. right? That's not an easy thing, I can tell you. It's not an easy thing. But it's far better to shame yourself than to shame someone else by looking at them as if they're an object of your desire and not a person created in the image of God. And so let's lift those people up, right? Let's move it past adultery to get to the heart of the problem, which begins with lust. The next one, and I know for sure I'm not getting through all 6, so this will be interesting. The next one, we're going to end with 3. In verse 31, it says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her a victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Is anybody stung by that a little bit? If you're stung by that, that's okay, because perhaps you should have been stinging from the first one when it was talking about anger and the way we talk to one another. Maybe that should have stung you too, because we don't quite live up to that standard. And maybe you should have been, your heart should have been stinging a little bit when we talked about lust, because we've all struggled with this one. And this idea of divorce stings a little bit because it's a problem in our society, right? We are a society that celebrates no-fault divorces. And Jesus wants to lift that up to a kingdom status. And so he says, you've heard it said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, don't do it at all, except for in the act of sexual immorality. And so the reference that Jesus is giving us comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. And it's just this idea that if somebody is displeased with their wife, if you're just displeased with your wife, you're able to give her a certificate of divorce and that she can go on her way, right? Now, Moses allowed this, but it wasn't God's intent. Why did Moses allow it? Moses let the people get a certificate of divorce as an act of mercy. See, God is a God of mercy. He desires mercy over sacrifice. And so he allowed Moses to give them this provision of divorce, because prior to this law that gave them a provision of divorce, people were still leaving their spouses. They were still abandoning their spouses. The problem is, without any legal way to do this under the Old Covenant, if you kicked your wife out, she was destitute. In fact, it was more likely to force her into some kind of real sexual immorality, because that would be the only way that she could really take care of herself in a culture that if you weren't married, you didn't have much opportunity. And so God, out of mercy, allowed that you could give your wife a certificate of divorce, because that gave her a little bit of dignity and allowed her to go and start a whole new life with someone else without continuing to break laws. See, here's the rule I want to give you. God desires mercy over sacrifice. But by the time we get to Jesus, the Jewish people had taken divorce for granted so much that any act of displeasure was a grounds for divorce. So we poke fun at it, but you could divorce your wife if she burned your dinner. You could divorce your wife if she didn't clean the laundry correctly. You could divorce your wife if she talks back to you, right? This was the kind of justification that people were giving in order to divorce their wives. And that is not God's intent for marriage. See, there's a point that I want to get out of this. It's that kingdom righteousness mimics God's values. God has a high value of marriage, not a low one. As kingdom citizens, with our righteousness that is supposed to surpass the Pharisees, we should value the things that God values. And God values marriage. I think maybe the best commentary on Deuteronomy chapter 24 is found in Matthew. And it's in Matthew chapter 19. And Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. And in verses 8 of chapter 19, Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your heart was hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. See, God had a plan for marriage in the beginning. It was that you were created so that you could complement someone, right? God took into Adam and removed from his rib and made woman to stand alongside of him, to be a helper. And Adam says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And the two will leave their father and mother and they'll be united to one another. So God's original intent, his original value for marriage is very high. But because people were abandoning their wives out of mercy, because God desires mercy over sacrifice, he gives them a provision for divorce. Then that devalues marriage to the point where you can divorce your wife for burning your potatoes. And so Jesus lifts it back up and says, no, this is how you should value marriage. And the only provision he gives is sexual immorality. And I searched for that word, and the word is porneia, which I don't have to define for you guys because you know what porneia means, even in our culture, sexual immorality. It's used 24 times in the New Testament, and every time it's a sexual sin. And so I began to struggle with this because I think God is a God of mercy, and there's got to be more provision for divorce than just sexual reasons, right? But there is. When we move on to 1 Corinthians, Paul gives us some more reasons or more provisions for divorce, and it shows us something about God's character. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10, it says, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband." I want you to recognize that Paul is still advocating for marriage. He's saying you should still stick it out if you can, right? A wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, not I, not the Lord. If a brother has a wife who is not a believer, she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if an unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother and sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live at peace. And I want you to understand that last point is really important. God has called us to live at peace. That's why he allowed provisions for divorce in the first place, because it wasn't bringing about peace. Women were being abandoned. And so out of mercy, God allowed this to happen in order to bring about peace, because God is a God of mercy. And when marriage is devalued, Jesus lifts it back up. But ultimately, what he wants out of his people is peace. God's not asking you to live in a dangerous situation. He's not asking you to stick out a marriage that is in constant conflict. What he wants for your life is peace. But he wants you to value the things that he values. He wants you to fight for it. I mean, really fight for it. Me and my wife, I didn't ask her this, so I hope it's okay, spent a year apart fighting for our marriage. We spent a year apart fighting for our marriage because we understood that God valued marriage. We weren't willing to just throw it away. And so we lived in separate places, but we fought for it. We fought for it because God is calling us to value it. Right? And there is times where I think at some point you have to leave because God is a God of mercy. God wants you to be at peace. Right? So I'm not advocating that you stay in these bad marriages. What I'm advocating for is that kingdom righteousness should surpass that of the Pharisees. It should value what God values. And because God values marriage, so should you. And you should fight for it. And that's something that's really difficult, but I'm telling you, fight for it. And if at the end of that fight, all you have to say is, I couldn't do anything else, then Paul would say, let him leave. You're not bound to that person. And so I want to end with that thought because I'm out of time. And I only got through 3 of the sections, and I wanted to get through 6. But I'm hoping that you can see that kingdom righteousness that surpasses the Pharisees values what God values. It begins right there in the heart. It includes what we think and what we say and the actions that we do. That's kingdom righteousness. And I'm not saying that we're righteous on our own. In fact, if anything, as we've gone through just these 3 sections, we should understand that our righteousness is like filthy rags. And that's why we seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. That's why we hunger and thirst for righteousness. And that's why we cling to the cross. Because that's the only way that I'm ever going to be able to stand in front of God.